Yeah, I think like all these things are happening for a reason, I think. I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's a great coincidence. We can believe that. But at the same time, I think like it's too much of a coincidence. And I think maybe it's like nice that this is happening
Okay.
right now.
We are online already. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our next episode of Eurasia Talks, the seminars organized by Karabuk University and Middle East Teknik University with the support of Dünyanın Ortası. And today we, as you may see from our announcement, we will talk about the war between Ukraine and Russia, and we have a very special guest for this, and whom I will present just a bit later. But we are doing it today, actually on a very special day for Ukrainian history, because today, on the 29th of January, 1918, it's our anniversary of Battle of Krute, which took place near Krute railway station, and it was a battle between Ukrainian soldiers and Bolshevik army, actually, and it has very symbolic meaning for Ukrainian history because due to this battle, the delay of capturing Kiev was possible, and because of that, Ukrainian government actually could conclude the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So on very symbolic day, today we have Dr. Yuri Shevchuk, and let me just give a very brief information about our today guests. And he is a lecturer at Columbia University, New York since 2004. And he is a graduate of Taras Shevchenko Kiev State University, where he earned a master's degree in theory and practice of translation and PhD in Germanic philology. He also earned a master's degree in political science from the New School of Social Research in New York City. At Columbia University, Dr. Shevchuk teaches courses in Ukrainian language, Ukrainian, Soviet, and post-Soviet cinema in 1990 and 2012. He taught Ukrainian at Harvard University Summer School, and he writes on Ukrainian language, cinema, culture, and identity. And I also very happy to announce that he is also now author of Ukrainian book as a beginner's Ukrainian with interactive online workbook. And one of probably the happiest and the nice announcement is that he wrote the Ukrainian English collocation dictionary, a very unique book as far as I could understood. And this book will be published this year on March. So Dr. Yuri, please, the floor is yours. I will pass the microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this wonderful Eurasia series. I have a bit of a connection with Turkey via Harvard, where I taught Ukrainian for 22 years at Harvard Summer School, and I had students from Turkey. And one of my students decided to make Ukrainian studies his career, and he's now his academic career, and his name is Hüseyin Oylupinar. He is from Izmir, and he defended his PhD at the University of Alberta, but he was my language student, and he speaks fluent Ukrainian. So I have a bit of a personal connection to Turkey. Also, I'm friends with a number of Ottomanologists, American specialists in Ottoman studies. One of them is in the University of Toronto. I know some in Kiev as well. And today I would like to share with you my thoughts about the aspect of Ukrainian-Russian relations that normally is overlooked or ignored when people talk about Ukraine and Russia. And namely, well, my talk is called Ukraine and Russia, the Invisible War. I hope you see my presentation, do you? Okay, very well. So basically, if people talk about Ukrainian Russian relations and particularly Ukrainian-Russian conflicts, they most of the time pay attention to the military conflict and overlook the war that has been waged for more than 3 centuries now, since the early 17th century, on the front of culture, of civilization. So, and this Russian war on Ukrainian culture and identity is my today's topic of my talk. So I'll start with this kind of idea that was famously articulated by Yuri Shevchuk, a great Ukrainian scholar and a visionary who taught at Columbia University, and he wrote a piece on an article dedicated to 300th anniversary of Ukrainian Moscow Pact called the Pereyaslav Council that started the dismantling of Ukrainian statehood by the Muscovite state. And there, when he dwelt on the cultural war between Russia waged by Muscovy against Ukraine, he noted that military defeat of one country by another can often be a temporary setback, and as such is not as important as the defeat in civilizational war, because the defeat, the loss in the war between two cultures can mean the disappearance of the culture of the people that had been vanquished. And he gives examples of ancient Greece that was defeated by Rome militarily, but thanks to the fact that its language, culture, and religion did not disappear, it persisted. Eventually, Greeks were able to again become an independent state. Much later then, the same pertains to ancient Rome that was defeated by barbarians militarily and then came back to life as separate nations of Spain, France, and Italy that continued their cultural kind of traditions of Rome, but also language. Their languages take roots in Vulgar Latin, and that was thanks to the fact that the Roman culture was never defeated by that of the barbarians. And these examples are many. I can quote more and more of them. So when we talk about the cultural war between Ukraine and Russia and Russian Empire first, Russian Tsars greatly appreciated the importance of cultural domination over non-Russians. And the Russian Empire attached a great importance to the program of assimilating non-Russians, including Ukrainians, with such an aim as to effect their disappearance, their dissolution in Great Russian or Greater Russian culture and language. So Russian imperial attitude towards Ukraine can be summed up in this famous expression by Pyotr Valuyev, the Minister of the Interior of the Russian government, that were uttered in 1863. And I quote, "There was no, there is no, and there can be no separate little Russian language." Little Russian language meaning Ukrainian language. And speaking of the language that did not, does not, and will never exist, he actually also meant Ukrainians as a civilization, as a culture, as a nation. So Russian attacks against Ukrainian civilization always singled out the Ukrainian language as the most important attribute of the Ukrainian national identity. So since the early 17th century, there were more than 130 prohibitions on the use of Ukrainian language in various forms. And most of them were the prohibitions by the Russian imperial government. There were also Polish prohibitions kind of imposed on the parts of Ukraine that were occupied by Poland. So if we look at modern Ukrainian identity in both kind of as it is today in synchronic plane, but also from the point of view of history in diachronic planes, we can easily kind of single out its important attributes, such as secular culture, religion, historical memory, language, and a number of others. Language, because I am primarily interested as a specialist, as a linguist, I'm primarily interested in language. So I will focus on matters of language, how Russian aggression against Ukrainian civilization manifested itself on its attacks throughout history on language. And I will focus in greater detail about the newest forms of this aggression against Ukrainian language today. So Russian imperialism has claimed that Ukraine and Russia share the same history, culture, religion, and territory. And you can see these claims, you can hear them in the Russian press today, in the pronouncements of Vladimir Putin and other leading representatives of Russian government. They say we are brothers. There is nothing separate between Ukrainians and Russians. We share our history. Ukrainian language is really a dialect. You can still hear that Ukrainian language is not a language as such, but really a southwestern dialect of Russian and so on. But the claim that language, Ukrainian language, is not a language but a dialect is really problematic, because even if a simple test, you speak Ukrainian to a Russian person and the person will not understand you. It's different enough for Russians not to be able to understand Ukrainian language. They understand it only when it's mixed, heavily mixed with Russian. So therefore, Russian civilizational war against Ukraine was particularly relentless against the Ukrainian language. Putting it simply, take away Ukrainian language and there will be little perceivable difference between the two countries. That is a kind of simplified Russian imperial understanding of this situation. So in order to understand the logic and dynamic of the current Russian war aimed at destroying Ukraine as identity and civilization, I propose to revisit the event that is usually referred to in Ukrainian historiography as the Holodomor. Holodomor is a central attribute of Ukrainian, a central element of modern Ukrainian identity. The word itself is a combination of two roots. One, holod, meaning hunger, and another is mor, meaning murder. So it means, Holodomor means murder by hunger. And this word is, in Ukrainian historical memory, is something alike the Holocaust in Jewish historical memory. And the Holodomor is a campaign of artificially organized hunger, the hunger that was organized by the Soviet government in 1932-33, with the aim of breaking the resistance of Ukrainian peasantry to the collectivization drive, but also with another aim of solving the Ukrainian question, to once and for all remove the Ukrainian desire for independence from the equation. So they confiscated everything edible in the Ukrainian countryside and immediately precipitated a mass hunger that in the course of less than just 1 year took away or killed by different accounts between 3.5 to 6.5 million Ukrainians. Soviet authorities then denied the Holodomor and forbade discussing it. Today, Russian official propaganda refuses to recognize the genocidal nature of the Holodomor. They say, oh, the hunger happened, but it was not intentional, and it was just an unfortunate coincidence of different factors. So the Holodomor, why I started talking about the Holodomor, promising you to focus more on language, because the conceptual framework that the Holodomor presents helps us understand the arc of 200 years of Russian aggression, cultural aggression against Ukraine. A humanist, the humanist Raphael Lemkin, he was a Polish lawyer of Jewish origin, coined the term genocide. The term that later, in the 50s, became a basis for the United Nations definition of genocide. And as a case study of genocide, Raphael Lemkin chose the Holodomor, organized by Moscow, and analyzed it. So describing the Holodomor, and this is important for my analysis, Lemkin singles out 4 directions of this campaign against Ukrainian civilization by Moscow. Number 1, the first was a blow to the head of the nation, meaning the destruction of Ukrainian political and cultural elites. You see here on the photograph a very famous building in the city of Kharkiv that in the 30s was the capital of Ukraine, of Soviet Ukraine. And this building is called the Word, Slovo. And it was built by Soviet authorities deliberately to concentrate all Ukrainian writers and leaders of cultural figures, playwrights, sculptors, filmmakers, poets, dramatists, actors, all in one building, so that they are easier to control. And after the attack after this first blow to the head of the Ukrainian nation, which started in the late 1920s and lasted all the way to the late 1930s, some 85% of all Ukrainian cultural figures who published something, and that includes writers and scholars and academics, were physically destroyed. The second blow, according to Lemkin, against the Ukrainian identity was a blow to the heart of the nation, meaning the destruction of the independent religious life. Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Catholic Church, anything independently Ukrainian that was a religious organization was forbidden. The priests were either executed or sent to Siberia for life and destroyed there. The third blow to the body of the nation, and that's the murder by hunger of Ukrainian peasants during 1932, 1933. And finally, the fourth dimension of the Holodomor, according to Lemkin, is the resettlement of Russians to the ethnically cleansed areas of Donbass and other Ukrainian territories in the 1930s and up until today, but also Crimea after 1944, when the autochthonous population of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars, were summarily declared traitors to the motherland and expelled from the territory, and every third of them died on the way to Kazakhstan and Siberia. So there are two understandings of the Holodomor, the narrow and the broader one. A Holodomor in its narrow sense is the physical destruction of Ukrainians, carriers of Ukrainian identity and speakers of Ukrainian language. This is the most widespread view of the genocide in scholarship and both also in public discourse. This is the kind of concept that we come across in such very influential publications as Robert Conquest's Harvest of Sorrow, Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, and most recently Anne Applebaum's The Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. Mass murder was never really abandoned by the Russian regime after 1933. It assumed other less obvious forms. In World War II, Ukrainians were treated by the Kremlin as cannon fodder. After Kyiv, for instance, was recaptured from the Nazis by the Soviets, thousands of men were rounded up and sent to the front line, unarmed, untrained, and in civilian clothes to, quote, wash off their own blood, the disgrace of having lived under the German occupation, end quote. During the Soviet war in Afghanistan, Western Ukrainians, this is the part of Ukraine that was not Russified as heavily as the rest of it, as well as youth from other non-Russian Soviet republics, the Baltic republics and Caucasus and Central Asia, were sent to Afghanistan in disproportionately large numbers. The same pertains to disproportionately large number of Ukrainians mobilized as liquidators of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. And current Ukrainian-Russian war shows very familiar patterns of Russian imperial behavior that happened before the war erupted in 2014. More than the expulsion of Ukrainians from occupied territories, more than 1,400,000 Ukrainians are internally displaced as refugees. They had to flee the areas occupied by Russia. I mean, the Crimea and the areas of Eastern Donbass. The occupation authorities, Russian occupation authorities, create the living conditions that are intolerable for Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. Ukrainian schools are closed, Ukrainian books, and Crimean Tatars as well. Ukrainian books and Crimean Tatar books are burnt. Cases of murder of Ukrainians in Russia-occupied Crimea and Donbass, and by Ukrainians, I mean Ukrainian citizens. That includes everybody, not just ethnic Ukrainians. Ukrainian churches are yet again, as if we are back in the 1930s, are persecuted and closed down. There is also the understanding of Holodomor in a broader sense of the word. And that includes not only physical destruction of Ukrainians, but the destruction of Ukrainian culture, religion, language, and historical memory, without which there is no Ukrainian identity, of course. And this is the kind of view of the Holodomor that has been advanced by Canadian historian Roman Serbin. The Holodomor in its broader understanding never really stopped. Even today, it takes new, ever-evolving forms. Russification is a soft form of genocide involving no mass murder by pursuing the same goals, meaning elimination of the Ukrainian nations through its assimilation into the Russian culture and Russian language. So Holodomor as linguicide, as a campaign against the language, the final destination of which is the death of Ukrainian language, its complete destruction. Language, as I already said, has always been singled out by Russian imperialism as object of aggression and violence. The Ukrainian language has for centuries been the object of Moscow's direct, indirect, and symbolic violence. A symbolic violence understood the way Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote a lot about this concept, understood it. As symbolic violence is violence wielded with tacit complicity between its victims and its agents, insofar as both remain unconscious of submitting or wielding it. So what were the historical forms of linguicide, of the aggression against the Ukrainian language? One, direct violence, which means the ban on the use of Ukrainian in public sphere, coercive strategies of various kinds with the aim to marginalize the language, to drive it out from public sphere, from strategic spheres of communication fraught with the possibility of political mobilization. Above all, schools, printing business, the press, government, and such. One is the Valuyev Circular of 1863 that banned the publication of educational and religious books in Ukraine, and followed 13 years after by M's Ukaz, which was a decree by the Tsar banning the publication of original Ukrainian texts, translations into Ukrainian, any books, theater performances, song concerts, teaching in Ukrainian. The goal of these forms of direct violence against the language was to remove Ukrainian from public communication. But there was also a specifically Russian original form of persecution of language that no other colonizers invented or thought of applying. And that is the interference into the inner structure of the Ukrainian language as such. And that interference meant replacing the Ukrainian literary standard with a set of rules that brought Ukrainian closer to Russia. A host of phonetic, morphological, lexical, and syntactic features were declared by the Russian imperial regime, that includes the Soviet Russian regime, as bourgeois nationalists, hostile, and therefore banned, edited out of all Ukrainian texts. The goal was to deprive Ukrainian of its authenticity, its originality, its wealth, to turn it into a pale simulacrum of the great powerful Russian language. This is a quote from Turgenev, a very popular meme that was implanted by the entire Soviet system of education into the minds of everybody, Russian and non-Russian, with the implication that Russian is great and powerful and non-Russian languages are poor and weak and not worth speaking. The goal of such interference into the inner system of the Ukrainian language was to make it unattractive for its own language community as a stigma of provincialism and backwardness, so that Ukrainians voluntarily themselves would refuse to speak it as not prestigious. And so I give you a couple of examples of this interference into the inner structure of the Ukrainian language at its different levels, at the level of sound structure and also graphemes. Letters were forbidden. Certain positions of phonemes were forbidden. I'm not going to dwell on this in detail so that we have time. I don't want to keep you too long, but if you are interested, we can revisit it. Then into morphology, Ukrainian entire cases were declared not really necessary and kind of pushed into oblivion, like the vocative case of nouns. There were cases when certain case endings were forbidden that were different from those in Russian and so on. There was also at the level of vocabulary a massive interference into Ukrainian lexical system. Hundreds of Ukrainian words were banned as bourgeois nationalists and replaced with Russian synonyms. As many as 15 word production patterns were ousted as, again, bourgeois nationalists and hostile, and replaced by very often clumsy Russian ones compared with the Ukrainian ones. Massive Russification of terminology. Russian was allowed as the only source of new terminological coinages, and forced archaization of Ukrainian seafaring, legal, and military terminology, and replacement of it with Russian terminology. But these are the kind of forms of aggression against the Ukrainian language that were applied by the Soviet regime. One would think that with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, this war against the Ukrainian language would come to an end. Not so. That was not the case. It took other forms, more kind of hidden, not direct, but no less effective. And one of these forms I'm going to dwell on at greater length today. I call it schizoglossia, or mixing Ukrainian with Russian. Mixing Ukrainian with Russian is using both these languages at the same time, in the same place, by two or more speakers. Imagine a television program, a broadcast, and there are two anchors. One of them is speaking Ukrainian, another one is speaking Russian. You are a Ukrainian, you are being interviewed by a journalist, you speak Ukrainian, the journalist speaks Russian with you. That's what I mean by mixing two languages in one place at the same time. So mixing Ukrainian and Russian is a seemingly spontaneous and random switching from Ukrainian to Russian. But there are two types of such mixing. One is as a consistent and unintended language policy, and intentional language policy. And this is what I'm interested in today. The other one, mixing Ukrainian with Russian as a spontaneous communicative behavior. The person just is lazy to control his or her speech production, and if a Russian word comes up to mind, they just say it. So that's of no interest to me today. So the typical attributes of such linguistically hybridized message are the following. Number one, Ukrainian plays a decorative function in such a message. If we talk about television, radio, it often opens a program. Sometimes it is used as a title for a program, like Ukraine Has Talent, Dances with Stars. Number two, Russian is dominant. It gets more time. The program is largely conducted in Russian. Russian is spoken as the native language. Ukrainian is often spoken as a second or non-native language. And if you listen to the kind of Ukrainian that is spoken by a journalist or by a TV anchor, it grates your ear. It doesn't sound natural and rich. It sounds like a verbatim translation from Russian, as if a language is not a language in and of itself, but some kind, again, of the pale simulacrum of Russian. Russian is expressively rich. It's pleasant to the ear. The viewer likes to listen it, admires it. A language of an educated person, rich with phraseology, with all kinds of allusions and stuff like that. Ukrainian, on the other hand, is recognizably translated from Russian, a language of a poorly educated individual, aesthetically difficult to listen to. Sometimes it's almost painful to listen to that kind of Ukrainian. Number seven, Russian speaker uses Moscow prosody, intonation patterns, but also way of pronouncing words, the orthoepy, and avoids coloring their speech with Ukrainian influences. There is Ukrainian variant of Russian, but it's avoided as less prestigious than the Moscow Russian. So that's another kind of attribute of such a hybrid message. Ukrainian speaker violates the basic norms of standard Ukrainian pronunciation and grammar. And sometimes it's very difficult, most of the time, difficult to find a speaker on Ukrainian television and radio whose speech can be taken as a standard, as a model for literary Ukrainian. So I'm, like, as a teacher of Ukrainian at a university, at Columbia University, I'm hard pressed to find a sample, a speech sample in modern Ukrainian, in contemporary Ukrainian television, radio, or film that I can tell my students, use this and follow it, imitate it. This is a nice model for imitation. All of that is kind of deployed against an entire, a specific set of beliefs about language that I will call a language ideology that is nurturing and justifying such language policy of mixing Ukrainian with Russian. So within that language ideology, Russian is traditionally presented as the language of interethnic communication in Ukraine. Having no command of Russian is considered to be an anomaly. This meme is not new. It's just, it migrated from the Soviet time, where Russian is the language of interethnic communication and no other. Even within Ukraine, or within, let us say, within Georgia, within any separate republic. So having no command of Russian is absolutely unbelievable. It's something out of question. Ukrainian is ethnically and ethnographically bound language of the village. So if you speak Ukrainian, within that ideology, you are immediately branded as a provincial, a yokel, a kind of narrow-minded opposite of modernity, of prestige, of fashion. It does not matter which language to speak, as long as people understand each other. That's another very, very popular meme within this ideology. In the Linguistically Hybrid Speech Act, a Ukrainian is always bilingual. For Ukrainians, it is unthinkable not to have a command of Ukrainian. Russian speakers are, on the contrary, monolingual. They don't need to know any other language but Russian. For them, it's unthinkable to want or to be able to speak Ukrainian. This ideology implies that speaking Ukrainian is almost below dignity. It's like degenerating to something much lower. Language is not one of the necessary traits of the political Ukrainian citizenship. One can very well be Ukrainian and not speak any Ukrainian, or refuse to speak Ukrainian. This kind of position is very, very popular and kind of actively spread and propounded by the oligarchic Ukrainian mass media, controlled by the oligarchs, that Ukrainian is not a necessary attribute of citizenship, the way Polish is so in Poland, Russian in Russia, let's say Turkish in Turkey. Can one imagine a Turkish citizen that is not fluent in Turkish? How can you be a citizen if you cannot communicate with your own compatriots using your own language? But not so in the Ukrainian, in the context of Russian imperial language ideology. And language rights are not part of European values or the values of the revolution of dignity. Okay. So this is so as a kind of a conclusion, language mixing is a ubiquitous form of mass communication in Ukraine. Mixed speech remains one of the most widespread format of Ukrainian mass media, such as television, radio, and filmmaking. Mixed Ukrainian-Russian speech is inescapable in today's Ukraine. It's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. You cannot escape it. And if you want your children to learn Ukrainian, you have to isolate them from the media, because the media will Russify them despite your best intentions. That's how it works these days. Language mixing prevents Ukrainians from learning their own language simply by being immersed in it. The way you can learn Spanish in Spain or French in France, Italian in Italy, simply by listening to the radio, watching television programs, watching the films. That's not the option for today's Ukraine. Ukraine is slowly developing in that direction, but it's not yet fully decolonized to present its own citizens with a similar situation conducive to learning Ukrainian by osmosis, simply by being exposed to it in the public space, in the media, and so on. Also, the important thing is that language mixing, the schizoglossia, disrupts the transmission of language between generations, from older generation to the younger generation. The latest statistic about the representation of Ukrainian, for instance, in such kind of age-specific spheres of communication as the internet, is really catastrophic. There is the share of Ukrainian messaging and text on the internet in various forms is falling, despite everything, is contracting, is diminishing. Language mixing is a new and effective form of linguicide, because what we see is a slow death of Ukrainian. I can talk at greater length about that and about the manifestations of this slow death, if you're interested. And finally, language mixing pursues the same goal as did the Holodomor in its broader understanding, to destroy Ukrainian as the main attribute of Ukrainian national identity. Thank you, and those were my remarks. If I hope I provoked your questions. Let me stop sharing.
Yeah, Dr. Yuri, thank you very much for this great presentation and very interesting presentation. And I have to say to our participants, so if you want to ask a question, could you please first write it to the chat? So by that way, we will see that you have a question and I will pass the word to you. For now, we have a few questions, and I guess we will start in a chronological way, starting from Ibrahim Muradov. So if Mr. Ibrahim is here, so he can ask this question personally, or if not, I can read. Just let me know, I mean, what should I do? Okay. Mr. Ibrahim. Okay, so probably,
here.
Yeah. Probably I will read the question. So, Dr. Shevchuk, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And first question, I would like to hear your view on the dispute between Ukrainian and Russian historians over the Kievan Rus. Do you see this dispute also as a part of civilizational war between the two nations? And the second question, do you generally think that the impatience of the advocates of the Euromaidan revolution somehow contributed to the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine by blocking a gradual or peaceful transition of power in Kiev?
Okay, great questions. One is, I won't pretend to know much about Kievan Rus, as this is not the area of my expertise. But from my perspective, the polemic between Ukrainian and Russian historians over Kievan Rus has a very long history. And it's basically the polemic about whether or not we have a shared history, whether we Ukrainians and Russians come from the same state and from the same historical formation, which was the great Duchy of Kyiv. And that is, in my view, a form, a manifestation of this hybrid civilizational war, because the Russian imperial view and understanding of history maintains that the myth of the single origin of three nations, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, originating all in Kyiv. And this also projects on their understanding of the development of three languages, Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian, from the common kind of Eastern Slavic language. Both were disproved academically, scientifically, with scientific arguments and also historical evidence as having no foundation in fact and in scientific data. Ukrainian language, and if we talk about the language which is closer to my expertise than historiography, is a separate language that is that shows already its very specifically Ukrainian attributes as early as the 10th century. The Russian imperial view of the development of these three languages maintains that they branched out around 14th century. If you look at the graffiti, the historical graffiti of the 11th century in St. Sophia's Cathedral in Kyiv, you already can see there specifically Ukrainian phonetic features that are absent from Russian and that mark Ukrainian as a separate language. And there are a number of such distinctive features at the level of the sound system, to say nothing of the systems that are more easily influenced by interaction with other languages. And so the irony, the historical irony of the shared origin of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus is that Ukrainian philosophers and Ukrainian representatives of Ukrainian religious elite articulated the theory of this common or shared origin with the hope that they would be admitted into the ruling kind of intellectual elite of the Russian Empire. And for instance, there is an article by Yuri Shevchuk called Moskva Maroseyka, where he writes about the concept and the design of Ukrainian cultural victory over Muscovy, kind of thought up by people like a number of Ukrainian representatives of Ukrainian religious, of Ukrainian church, Ukrainian bishops, who went to Moscow and started propounding the theory that Muscovy, there was no Russia then, the word Russia was not even used then, it was Muscovy, that Muscovy and Muscovite Tsardom had in fact a 1,000 longer history because it developed from Kyiv, not from Muscovy, but from Kyiv, the mother of all Russian cities. And the irony of it all is that this theory first was articulated by Ukrainians. And this article, I have it, its translation was not yet published in English, but a student of mine translated it. It's a great article. I'm prepared to share it with you so that I don't expand too much on it. There are other questions, but I'll be prepared to send it to to Dr. Bilecka so that she could share it in English with you. It's a very good read, and it opens a lot of eyes on this subject matter and how this war, this cultural war, was waged. Ukrainians lost it, and Yuri Shevchuk writes in greater detail about the reasons why Ukrainians lost this cultural competition with Muscovy, and how Muscovy incorporated the theory in its imperial kind of self-vision, but then discarded those who articulated this theory. As to the revolution of dignity precipitating, if I understand correctly the question, whether or not the revolution of dignity precipitated Russian attack against Ukraine, well, to me, such an approach is very close to, is very akin to blaming when the aggressor, the raper, blames the victim for the fact that he raped the victim, that the victim provoked the rape. And that's a very common, that's a very popular kind of story in today's Russian press, that Russia was provoked. If you look closer at the justification of Russian aggression, and the justification was such that Russians had to defend Russian speakers in Ukraine against murderous junta in Kyiv that was about to start killing Ukrainian citizens who spoke Russian. Well, again, there are no facts that prove that this is correct. No murders of Russian speakers were recorded before or after the Russian attack against Ukraine. Quite on the contrary, Russian attack against Ukraine precipitated a huge flood of refugees, murders of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars simply for the fact that they speak Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar, and that's documented. There's a record of this and evidence of this, not simply as some kind of flux, but as a consistent policy of Russian occupiers in Ukraine. And also there is a very popular argument that Ukrainian Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, should not have canceled the law on languages, because that was the reason for Russian attack. Well, the attack happened before it was canceled, number one. Number two, it was canceled, but it was not ratified. The president of Ukraine, the pro tempore, the provisional president of Ukraine, who was the speaker of the parliament, refused to sign it. So it had no force. So there's nothing to discuss here, and rather than Russian ideological falsehoods and fakes, basically. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, thank you very much. And when Dr. Shevchuk will share the article with me, I will publish it on the Facebook page and YouTube page of Dünyanın Ortası under the video. So if you are interested, just check it after the seminar is finished. And the next question we will have from Ashik Hoja. So Hojam, can you just read your question?
And thank you very much, Dr. Shevchuk. I actually, this was a great talk, which kind of made us, for those of us who joined 2 weeks ago, Professor William Fearman's talk as well, to kind of like compare the two cases of Kazakhstan and Ukraine. I know there are many differences, but at the same time, they were exposed to similar processes of Russification. And some of the highlights from his talk were about the perception of the society. I mean, those in Ukraine who define themselves as Ukrainians, but also Russians or Ukrainians who define Russian language as their mother tongue. I know the governments do a lot of apply a lot of policies that does not always resonate with people, or they easily find ease in, just like I know that Russians did in the past to Kazakhs. That's kind of my field, and a kind of feeling of superiority came with it. And I think you talked about that as well in your speech. I mean, how can we change, or how long do you think the Ukrainian language need, or how long Ukraine need the Ukrainian language to become a language that it deserves to be? I mean, so it's related to status of language, I guess, at the societal level. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Thank you very much, because it is connected with so many other things. Mm-hmm. Even with the kind of colonized, the inherited colonized status of Ukrainian language is still very much there, and it's manifested in many ways. For instance, it is considered that a very important area for language future, for a language to have a future, is for a language to have slang and to have colloquial subsystem of the language. Why? Because slang is the kind of a laboratory of innovation, where new things are created, where very expressions and words that appeal to the younger generation of people are created, and thus through them the language wins the new generation over. That's why it's so important. The problem with Ukrainian, compared for instance to Polish, which I speak, and Russian, which I speak, and English, which I speak, is that Ukrainian has almost no slang of its own. The only slang Ukrainian has, or 90% of the slang that Ukrainian has, is borrowed from Russian, and very often sounding Russian, with Russian phonetics that violates Ukrainian phonetical rules. And so you end up, when you are a young person and you want to be cool, you want to be fashionable, you want, if you are a boy, you want the girls to like you. If you're a girl, you want the girls to like you. You know what I mean. And you do it through language, through being cool with language. And so in that sense, Ukrainian is still to create its own slang. And you cannot create your own slang if you hear Russian all around you all the time. So in that sense, that's one thing. Number two, and this has been pointed out on many occasions, Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union its political, its economic, its financial, and its military elites. There were no clear break between the elites. What happened was, and Serhiy Plokhy, who spoke before me in his book about the collapse of Soviet Empire, he points out that the reason it happened so easily in Ukraine was that Ukrainian communists were afraid of Yeltsin. That Yeltsin, if they do not separate from Russia by declaring independence, it was not because they were patriots of Ukraine. They were scared of Yeltsin's doing bad things to them, the bad things that he did to Russian communists, like declaring the Communist Party a criminal organization. And so basically what happened, they preserved their position, their hegemony in politics, economy, and everything else. So what I mean to say is that when the television cameras are switched off, Ukrainian government is conducted in Russian, not in Ukrainian. Ukrainian finances and business and banking are conducted in Russian, not in Ukrainian. Ukrainian generals in the army speak Russian still all too often? And would you dare to speak to a general who speaks Russian, to speak to him Ukrainian? Probably not. I wouldn't imagine a subordinate officer having the courage to speak back. Ukrainian Minister of the Interior, the one who is in charge of law enforcement, cannot for the life of him speak Ukrainian. Avakov, he speaks Russian. Can you guess what his subordinates would speak to him? Probably Russian too, if they want to be on his good side. So Ukrainian is still to undergo a major process of decolonization, of becoming a complete language, of becoming a language. Remember how the Zionist Volodymyr Zhabotinsky said that Israel will become feasible when Hebrew will be spoken by prostitutes. That means that everybody speaks, even prostitutes speaks Hebrew. So that means that everybody will speak Hebrew. So we have still to have Ukrainian prostitutes to start speaking Ukrainian, if I borrow that kind of a metaphor from Zionism, which was also about language. And you know, Jews had a much more challenging task of reviving Hebrew, which was dead language, which was only religiously used, which was ritual language, and making it into this vibrant, rich, and completely full stuffed language that can service any sphere of communication, from swear words to high poetry, from science to information technologies. Have I answered your question, or confused?
That was great. No, I was like, it was more than like, I mean, it really kind of like enlightened my perspective, the way I see I view the issue, and I like the examples a lot. So here's the lesson. We need to know, I guess for Ukrainian youth especially, learn slang in Ukrainian or invent it.
Also,
Thanks.
you know, my students, every time I speak in Ukraine, and when I say, you know, one of the first questions people ask me in Ukraine, why would Americans want to learn Ukrainian? Because they still think that Ukrainian is such a stigma that no normal person would want to learn Ukrainian. Tell us, who are these Americans, these weird, strange Americans who would want to pay $6,000 a semester to learn Ukrainian? And that's imperialism, that's Russian imperialism, or call it racism or suprematism, speaking through the mind of these, you know, journalists who ask me. All in all, every time I am in Ukraine, that question would always be posed.
It's so sad. I mean, same in Kazakh. I think it's changing slowly though in Kazakhstan. I do hope that that's true for Ukrainian. Like, people really need to realize that their language is actually beautiful and important. Anyways, I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, maybe I have just before we pass to the next question from Turgut Hoca, I just will ask very, very small comment about what you said in the last. Like, is there any difference in time since 1991 to 2021? Yeah, 2021. Okay. So is there any difference? Can we say that it's the situation is changing, or it's the same, or it's going backward, or any improvements, or like improvement and not improvement? So if we see this 30-something years as a line, is there any difference?
Yes, there is a difference, and compared to where we started in 1991, a rather small segment of Ukrainian society behaved assertively as to
Dr. Shevchuk's microphone is muted.
Can you hear me now? I can't hear Julia, but I can. But you're nodding.
Okay.
Okay, and now I hear you. Can I continue?
Yeah.
So we have to look at two different things. Even though political rights and language rights are often connected, but in Ukraine, political rights were in a way divorced from language rights. And so the movement towards Ukraine's independence was so appealing across the board that more than 90% Ukrainians voted for separation from Russia in 1991 and regaining declaration of or confirming the declaration of Ukrainian independence. And that included also the Crimea, where more than a half of the most Russified, heavily Russified, but also populated by former Russian generals and you know, the pensioners from Moscow and stuff like that. Even Crimea. So there was voted for political independence. As to the language rights, they were lagging behind the demands for political independence. Why? Because the imperial minority in Ukraine was very jealous of preserving, was very nervous about losing its hegemonic position that it inherited from the Soviet Union. And so every demand on the part of rank and file common Ukrainians to the effect that we want to be serviced in a supermarket in our own language, not in Russian. We want to be able to read newspapers in Ukrainian and not in Russian, were perceived by Russian imperial minority exactly the way the demands by Black Americans in America, Black Lives Matter, are perceived by the supporters of Trump, not as the demands for equality, but as a demand for repressing and discrimination against the Russians. And so as we progress from 1991 to today, on the one hand, Ukrainians increasingly realize the importance of the revival of their language, and so they are self-organized. There are increasingly more influential civil society organizations that lobby for decolonization, for restoring to Ukrainians the status of the language of the country, the titular language of the country that it didn't have. And that included education in Ukrainian from the first grade all the way to the doctoral level. That included conducting trials and the entire court system be in Ukrainian, businesses be in Ukrainian, television, radio. Imagine that only some 6 years ago, only 4% of music broadcast on radios in Ukraine was Ukrainian. Some 60% was Russian, and the rest was English. So, and that's in Ukraine. That is the country where 90% of people, excuse me, during the last polls, consider Ukrainian to be their mother tongue. Even Ukrainians who speak Russian as their first language, they are still sentimental about the Ukrainian, and in these polls, they say they name Ukrainian as their mother tongue. It's a very interesting phenomenon. So today, for instance, we have progress. We have Ukrainian. A greater part of Ukrainian filmmaking is done in Ukrainian. the situation in radio changed dramatically. There is a lot of support for the Ukrainian language songs. Foreign films have been dubbed into Ukrainian since 2008, and that also created a kind of attachment, association of something fashionable. Like, for instance, you watch an American film dubbed in Ukrainian and nothing happens. No, the sky doesn't fall on earth. People first kind of found it strange and then got accustomed to it very quickly. And then even more so, people started visiting cinemas more often when the films were translated not into Russian, but into Ukrainian. So definitely there is a progress, but every time there is a progress, there is also an attack by Russian beholden oligarchic media and politicians against Ukrainian. And we are in the middle of such an attack today. For instance, on the 16th of January, a law on the status of Ukrainian language as the state language required, please don't laugh, that everywhere in the service industries, supermarkets, service industry, the customer should be serviced in Ukrainian. The very fact that there should be such a law is mind-boggling. It's incredulous to think of such a necessity in any other country. But in Ukraine, you had to introduce a legal norm requiring a customer to be served in Ukrainian. And guess what? There has been an official statement by the Russian government criticizing that law as fascist or as discriminatory, as an attack against Russian minority in Ukraine. There's also, for instance, the day before yesterday, a Ukrainian court canceled the new Ukrainian system of orthography, declaring the courts are now interfering with linguistics. No, I can't imagine any American court deciding that linguistic matters, orthography, is its jurisdiction. Linguistic matters are decided by linguists. It's as ridiculous as, I don't know, archaeology or gynecology is decided by a court decision or something, or the treatment, what treatment is better for cancer. And the judge decides that he is well within his jurisdiction to pass a decision on the best treatment of COVID or some such thing. But this is possible in Ukraine. So there is an improvement. And in certain spheres, particularly in the sphere of when people realize, when society realizes that without language, there can be no nation, particularly with the aggressor, with the imperial Russia that cannot imagine itself without Ukraine. So this realization is greater and greater.
Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, yeah, it was. I was going to ask you about this canceling of spelling rules, because, like, for me, it looks like one small but step back. I hope that they will, I don't know, find a way to again introduce that rules, because we already started to implementing them. And our next question will be from Turgut Hoca. So, Turgut Hoca, please, can you ask a question?
Much. Actually, I have two questions, but one is rather a historical one, so I will skip it and ask my question about what's going on today in Ukraine. Actually, there have been several language laws or language-related laws in Ukraine in the last 10 or so years, starting from 2012. And 2014, 2017, 2019, and this year. So I would like to ask about the 2017 law on education. So in this law, after the 5th grade, the language of instruction was decided, Ukrainian became the obligatory language of instruction after the 5th grade. And actually this law attracted a lot of criticisms from the Romanian and Hungarian minorities in Ukraine, and also from Ukraine and Hungary, as well as EU. So my first part of my question is, how do you evaluate, how do you assess this law with respect to minority rights and Ukraine's international relations with Hungary and Romania? And the second question is that, again, this is about this law in law of 2017. Actually, this law is quite interesting because whereas it's language to be the main language of instruction for the minorities, it makes an exception for the indigenous people of Ukraine, namely the Ukrainian Tatars, Krimchaks, and Gagavuz. These three ethnic groups are not obliged to use Ukrainian language after the 5th grade. So Ukrainian law makes a distinction between the Ukrainian minorities, the indigenous minorities and the minorities. How would you evaluate such kind of distinction? What could be the reason of making such a distinction between non-ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine? Thank you.
And thank you. These are great questions. And I always find it helpful to look at things in Ukraine by all means in their historical context, because without it you will not be able to understand what's going on and the reasons behind them, but also at the context, at a larger context. So if we talk about minority language rights, there are minorities like Hungarians, Romanians, Gagauz, Belarusians, Poles, Jews, and there is an imperial minority, which is Russians. Russians very often like to represent other minorities, which is kind of ludicrous, because historically, 50% of minority languages in the Soviet Union were disappeared by Russian Russification, as a result of Russification. So historical record doesn't tell us that Russians can represent any other minority but themselves. But they take the language of minorities and the language of protecting minority languages as their cause, not because they really care about Hungarian or Russian in Transcarpathia or any other minority language, but because they want to preserve the hegemony under the status of minority, their own language, their own hegemony. And that's exactly what happened in 2012 when the law, the Kivalov-Kolesnichenko law on minority languages was passed, and Russian was de facto turned into the only state language in Ukraine, because Ukrainian was made dispensable, elective, not obligatory, and everything went back to Russian, including government business and everything else. So that is an important thing to keep in mind every time you hear the talk of minority languages. The second important thing is historical. Ukraine, unlike Hungary and unlike Romania, is the only, Romanians and Hungarians have their nation states where their languages are not threatened. There is no threat. You cannot make an argument that anybody threatens to the future of Hungarian language or the future of Romanian language. They flourish, they develop in their own territories. And so that perspective is different for Ukrainians, because Ukrainian is threatened with extinction in its own historic territory. That's why the nervousness on the part of Ukrainians every time somebody uses minority languages as an argument to prevent Ukrainian from decolonizing itself. That is also, I propose, that is an important dimension to be taken into consideration. The same pertains to other indigenous languages of Ukraine that have no other territory in the world other than that in Ukraine, the Crimean Tatars. That's why they enjoy this kind of exemption, the kind of most favored status, and Gagauz, as you said. Now, the third important consideration that you have to keep in mind, that there is law and there is reality. There is de jure and there is de facto. The schools that are, if you look at Ukrainian statistics, 100% or close to 100% of schools, elementary schools in Ukraine, maybe slightly less, but statistics will give you 100%, are Ukrainian language. If you go in Kyiv to most of the schools, you will not hear Ukrainian spoken there. I know it from my own experience. I know it from documents that were created by civil society organizations monitoring the implementation of language laws. What happens is that Ukrainian language is spoken pro forma during class, outside the class, or when the teacher forgets, she switches to Russian. Outside the class, it's Russian as well. And the students end up, as one of the kind of after effects of this weird distribution of roles between Russian and Ukrainian in school that are considered to be all Ukrainian, they are not. Russian is the language of prestige, and Ukrainian is the language of a stigma. And so there are many websites that document things like, lately there was a scandal in Odessa when a high school teacher reprimanded and started humiliating a student, a girl, at school for speaking Ukrainian in a nominally Ukrainian school. And so we don't have the statistics that we can reliably rely on based on our judgment of the real language situation in Ukraine. But you don't even need the statistics. You can just simply enter a school in Kyiv, in Odessa, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, in probably in all around Ukraine, with the exception of three provinces in Western Ukraine, in Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, and the Volhynia, Rivne, Lutsk, probably Zhytomyr. I'm not sure about that. Zhytomyr, Chernivtsi as well. The rest, I can bet you, there will be this kind of two parallel realities: the de jure, what the law provides for, and what the reality is. I don't know if I answered your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Shevchuk. And the next question we have from Professor Sezai Özçelik. Sezai Hocam, can you read your question if you are here? Okay, I guess I will do this. Sezai Hocam?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you, I guess. So please, you can read your question.
I can't hear anything. I don't know if
no. Sezai Hocam?
Are you here? You can read the question? No?
Okay, we can hear you right now.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. My question is about Holodomor. I think there should be more published. Many people don't know Holodomor enough, and there are some movies and novels about it, such as Mr. Jones and Bitter Harvest. And my question is this: do you think that there are enough for the publicization of the Holodomor, or Ukrainian state or diaspora in Canada and United States should work more about the movies and novels about Holodomor? And also, I mean, as a suggestion, also it's important to mention the sürgün, the Crimean Tatar sürgün as a Soviet genocide, as a continuation of Holodomor. What do you think about that also? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer your last question first. Thank you for your very interesting two questions. In the Ukrainian context, for the purpose of Ukraine as a state, as a nation, of course, I see the expulsion, the murderous, genocidal expulsion of Crimean Tatars from their ancestral lands is part of this arc of genocide against Ukraine and against indigenous Ukrainian population. And I agree with you, it's probably a rhetorical question, that there is by far not enough. We are only at the beginning of processing Holodomor as the event singularly constitutive of the Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian national psychology, Ukrainian perception of the world and of themselves. We don't realize how deeply it affected us. If we are only starting articulating this question, and it's not only diaspora kind of was the first one to initiate the Holodomor awareness campaign, both at the level of academic studies, but also at the level of public discourse, of conversation on this matter, simply because it was forbidden to talk about it in Ukraine. And if you watch films on Holodomor, there are by far not enough in numbers. Some of them are documentary, and they feature people, survivors of the Holodomor, remembering what they went through, and then at a certain point asking, are they going to throw me to prison? They are still afraid. They are still deeply traumatized by what happened to them. But the entire society, and also I think it's instrumental. For instance, there were films made about the Holodomor, but just to give you a comparison, by the calculations or estimates that I read, between 10 and 20 films are made on the subject matter of the Holocaust every year. And nobody says that the subject matter is exhausted, that we have to stop doing that. Not only because it's not exhausted, but also because in many ways it comes back to us in the form of other genocides, whether it be Rwanda, or now one can argue the genocide of Crimean Tatars who cannot be in their ancestral territory who they are, and you know, foster, cherish their culture, their language, their identity. In Ukraine, I can count probably on the fingers of my two hands the number of films about the Holodomor that were made, and most of them were so-so. There were very few films that are really very powerful, that would just appeal to the imagination. The number of stories that the Holodomor contains is endless, and each of them is fascinating and needs to be told. So we have to do that in film, on television, in literature, in all forms of human expression. And I don't know, this was not mentioned, but I have, since 2004, I have been running the Ukrainian Film Club at Columbia University, which is the only Ukrainian film forum, permanent film forum outside Ukraine. And I know all these films. I have shown all of them. And some of them we organized American premieres with the invitation of the directors, of other participants of the film. And so we even organized a conference, a scholarly conference in 2010, I think, at Columbia University, called The Holodomor in Film. And we discussed the challenges of bringing Holodomor out to not only the collective awareness of Ukrainians, but also of the world. Because you will not understand, if you are not Ukrainian, you will not understand Ukraine and Ukrainians without taking into account what happened in the 1932-33. And if you take the wider concept of Holodomor, is still happening now. And if you are Ukrainian, you will not understand your own motives sometimes when you do not realize the trauma, the collective trauma that was visited on the nation during the Holodomor, and then the famine of 1946-47 after the war, and it repeated, whether in the form of famines or in the form of wars or in the form of Chernobyl, or nobody is talking about the new Chernobyl happening in Donbass. And in the Crimea, the Russians are turning those lands into wastelands, into ecological catastrophes, into wastelands that are impossible, that will become impossible to live on after they are gone. And that's also Holodomor in the logic of Russian-Ukrainian relationship. And I think we have to problematize it and talk about it and bring it into the public discourse as something without which you will never understand neither Ukraine nor Ukrainian-Russian relationship.
And
thank you very much for the question.
Thank you.
And may I just add a very brief comment about the works on Holodomor, because I just want to remind our participants that last year Embassy of Ukraine in Turkey published and translated and published two great books about Holodomor. They translated into Turkish and published. So now also information about Holodomor is available not just in Ukrainian and English as it was before, but also in Turkish. And of course, I have to mention about the great work of Turgut Hocam, who prepared a podcast this year about Holodomor of 5 episodes with interviewing different people and different perspectives of Holodomor. So like, if you are interested in this topic, please find these books. And I mean, these books can be found also online as far as I remember. And of course, Turgut's Hocam's podcast can be found on the Dünyanın Ortası website. Okay, and we have one comment from Irina Driga. I mean, it's not a question, but rather a comment. But if Irina Hoja would like to say it in loud, we would be happy. If not, I would read probably this. Okay, Irina Hoja. Okay. So, like, we have interviewed Crimean Tatars and other representatives of Turkic-speaking citizens of Ukraine in 2015 and 2020. We met very interesting answers about the fact that after 2014, Ukrainian became a language of protection from Russian aggression for many of them. So for those who never had used Ukrainian before in 2014, it was enough strong motivation to start speaking Ukrainian, not to look as Russians, not to be Russians, not to present Russian-speaking population in our country. And probably I can say same thing about the Ukrainian diaspora in Turkey, because after 2014, many, including me, many of our representatives just switch in one day, from Russian, because like it was a way how usually diaspora speaks to Ukrainian, and like now from day to day I can see how it's growing and how still people are switching because of the situation because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. So like the war actually make people to think what language they speak, and make people to think about their identity.
Well, that's a kind of, if I can react to that
of course.
very interesting comment, that is a flip side of what Russia has always done with language, but also with Russian culture, namely weaponized language and culture. Russian imperialism throughout its history turned their culture and their language into weapons of colonial projection and aggression. And so Putin famously said that Russia ends where Russian language ends. That caused a very predictable reaction on the part of Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians particularly, who didn't want to be who didn't want Putin to protect them. And so the easiest way to do that was publicly to demonstrate that they don't speak Russian. They speak Ukrainian and they're happy about it. And so Putin, in a strange kind of way, in a counterintuitive kind of way, one can say in an absurd kind of way, precipitated an entire tendency among Russian-speaking Ukrainians to side with their Ukrainian-speaking compatriots by switching from Russian to Ukrainian. And that pertains not only to common Ukrainians, but also to representatives of Russian-speaking Ukrainian cultural elite. We know a number of Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, writers who very publicly switched from their mother tongue Russian. Some of them, like Volodymyr Rafeyenko from Donetsk, won all imaginable Russian literary prizes for his writings in Russian. He publicly switched from Russian into Ukrainian and started, despite the fact that it was not very easy for him. One thing is to speak in the street, another thing is to create very original literature. But he did that, and he published one book, Monde Green it's called. It's a wonderfully interesting book where he actually ponders, philosophizes about what it feels to discover the language of your own country that you have not noticed up until now. And now you are thrilled that you are discovering it. There are other people who did that. So in that sense, it's and also the easiest way to declare your own civic solidarity is to speak the language of your people, of your country. And so when you speak, particularly when you are under attack by people who say Russia goes as long as the Russian language, of course, sensibly, if you have any kind of instinct of survival, you will need to switch to Ukrainian publicly. You can still speak Russian in your homework, in your home, but publicly it becomes a political act, a political stance that you take in the time of war, not in a neutral kind of time. In a way, it's not even your own decision any longer. It's the decision that the aggressor imposes on you, that you simply, out of moral and ethical obligation, have to take if you want to survive.
And probably I will take the floor and ask the next question, because it's kind of connected. And this question is also about diaspora. Because you mentioned that during Soviet time, the Ukrainian culture and identity was presented as a peasant culture, as something like what is not intellectual, let's say. So now in diaspora, we have, I don't know, maybe in American and Canadian diaspora, it's even in a great way, but in Turkey, among Ukrainian diaspora, we have this problem. So whenever we need to present Ukrainian culture, we started to present this traditional village stuff, and like, I don't know, from one side I say, okay, it's really something probably different that can catch the Turkish, I don't know, the audience, yeah, because it's something traditional, let's say. But on the other side, I feel like we try to continue this Soviet style of presenting Ukraine as something that belonged only to religion, to peasant culture, let's say. So, I mean, how to find this balance? I mean, it's my probably personal question, but also it connects to this identity stuff and problems with continuation of Soviet type of Russian, maybe not Russian, but let's say Soviet type of pressing on Ukrainian culture?
It's an excellent question, and thank you for it. It's an excellent question, and I can deliver a lecture, a separate lecture on it. But basically, this reductive view of Ukrainian identity as only ethnographic historically is completely justified because the colonizer, Russian colonizer, allowed Ukrainians to express themselves almost exclusively as a rural, provincial, and village nation. And therefore, all the trappings of Ukrainian ethnography, like the embroidered shirts, you know, the painted eggs and everything else, is part of that manifestation, that expression. And strangely enough, or not, Ukrainians themselves were taught to think of themselves only as that, only in this reductive kind of way. It's as strange as if Americans would only be presented as cowboys and nothing else, or I don't know what else. So in fact, Ukrainians have to get rid of this imposed, narrowing self-vision of themselves as only in terms of ethnographic manifestation of what they have. Because this is just one part of being Ukrainian. Ukrainians have to learn, by the way, that unlike Russians, they are a world culture. They are a global culture. Because Ukrainians, probably only like Jews, or maybe a little bit like Armenians, have very powerful diasporas all around the world. And in that sense, without any exaggeration, Ukrainian identity is a global world identity. We have centers of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian scholarship, Ukrainian art in the United States, in Canada, in France, in Britain, in Italy, in Russia there were, but they were destroyed lately. There were libraries that were closed down, the churches and everything. And now there is an increasingly felt Ukrainian presence in Turkey as well. And in that sense, and I'm not exaggerating, Ukrainians are a global nation. And that is not, you cannot be a global nation and be provincial. You cannot. And so, like in 2 years, we are organizing at Columbia University an international conference, Diaspora as the manifestation of the global character of Ukrainian civilization. And so I'm not saying this as something poetic or metaphoric. It's indirect in the most direct sense. But the trick is that Ukrainians themselves have to discover the global nature of their culture. They have to appropriate what Ukrainians in America, in South America, in Europe, in Russia did in the way of contribution to their culture on the Ukrainian mainland. Not only in literature, but also in language, but also in science, in all other spheres of human activity.
Thank you very much. It was very enlightening for me personally, and I hope for everyone from our diaspora who is watching right now. And we have a question from Mr. Gennady Poberezhny, but I guess you kind of already answered it in the previous comments about this Ukrainian orthography. So, Gennady, if you want, you can, of course, read your question. Maybe
I already read it. I just wanted to say hello. Gennady is an old friend, and I'm thrilled.
Okay.
He decided. I know him from Harvard, He worked on this, on cartography of the Holodomor at Harvard University, and so I'm very pleased that he had time to join us today. Well, what I can say is that this decision of the appellate court to scrap the revised Ukrainian orthography simply says that this is just another manifestation of this aggression against Ukrainian language, and also manifestation of the revanche, the kind of a comeback of Yanukovych and Russian agents of influence in Ukrainian court system, but also in Ukrainian political class and political elite, because the court would not dare do that without the very solid political backing that it enjoys taking these decisions. So I don't think it's gonna go anywhere far. What it will do, in my opinion, is cause a kind of a political mobilization around the orthography and a kind of pushback, a reaction that would be well, the government said that they would appeal the decision of the court, but there's a very pronounced reaction of civil society in Ukraine, criticizing, blasting the court for that.
If I may, I'd just like to draw everybody's attention to the reason given to protect the interest of a particular child in southern Ukraine.
Right. That's to make it, to give us a comic relief by presenting that reason.
You do believe they do believe in what they say, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, that the court with a great reputation. So, like, what can we expect? And we have the last question from Mohammed Safakurk about the church and Orthodox Church. And if he is here, Mohammed Bey, are you here? Okay.
I already read it.
Okay, great. So probably we have to say it in loud so other participants also can understand. You cannot use the microphone. Okay. So
I want to ask that how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church position itself in the clash between Russia and Ukraine. Does the separation of patriarchates of Kiev and Moscow mean anything to the ordinary people in Ukraine? I'm not going to invent a wheel or discover America for you by saying that the history of the orthodoxy, of Christian orthodoxy, of the Orthodox Church, kind of tracing its origins all the way to Byzantium, is the history of siding with the state. Orthodox churches traditionally support their states, and so Ukrainian Orthodox Ukrainian autocephalous church, that was the Kiev Patriarchate, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, as it's called now, sides is a church of Ukrainians, of independent Ukraine, and it's a very powerful factor in Ukrainian decolonization process of Ukraine becoming a free and democratic nation. And so in that sense, the church plays incredibly important role by extolling and rising the value of attachment of its followers to their own country, patriotism. Russian church in Ukraine is another extension of Russian power, and it's an instrument of Russian control, projection of Russian power in Ukraine, and also a Russian aggression. Again, there are a lot of things to be said about how Russian church enables and facilitates military, but also civilizational aggression of Moscow against Ukraine, both today and in history. And the separation of Ukrainian, of the recognition of Kiev Patriarchate by Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople, is incredibly important as a kind of confirmation and recognition of the right for Ukrainians to have their own independent church, the one that was destroyed by the Soviets in the 1930s, but also persecuted by Russian dynastic empire before then. And so it cannot be overrated. It is so very important. I will just limit myself to saying that.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess it was the last question from our audience. And it was a great presentation and very dynamic and very informative. So like personally, even for me as a Ukrainian and as a part of diaspora, thank you very much for coming and accepting our invitation. And
thank you very much. Thank you. The pleasure was all mine, and I'm glad I met such interesting people. I hope we continue to be in touch. And if it's up to you, I mean, there are all these people I can help you, the films that you can watch and stuff.
Films, yeah, I was about to ask you, just name 3 movies about Ukraine or Ukrainian movies that a foreign audience must watch.
Okay, number one, and this is, number one is the film that represents Ukraine today for the Oscar consideration, for the Academy Awards. The film is called Atlantis, and on the 17th of February, we are going to be hosting on Zoom the director of that film, Valentin Vasyanovich. The film got fantastic reviews in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times. It won the prestigious Orizzonti Award at the Venice Film Festival and was at more than 50 film festivals around the world. And you should be able to watch it. I'm going to announce it today. It's a pay-per-view because the distributors of the film want you to pay for it. It's $12 in the United States. I don't know if it's but you can also attend my conversation with Valentin Vasyanovich by registering as it's a webinar like yours today. So that's number one. Another film, which is the film, by the way, Atlantis is about Ukraine in 2025, when Ukrainians finally liberated all of its territory, including the Crimea, from Russian occupation. And they are deeply traumatized and how they are trying to survive. It's a great film. It's not an easy film. It's a very challenging film, but very humanistic and very impressive. Then I would like you to watch the film to educate yourself about the Holodomor, The Living. I really love that film. It's the best film about the Holodomor, The Living. And you can watch it on YouTube. It's available on YouTube with English subtitles. The director is Serhiy Bukovsky. I showed it everywhere in North America, in Canada, in the United States. We had an American premiere of that film at Columbia University, which was great success. And I also would like you to watch a classical film that is a cult film, the film that has a cult following around the world. It's called The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. You asked me for 3 films. The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. It's an incredibly rich film by Sergei or Sarkis Parajanyan, so Sergei Parajanov in his Russified form, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. My students love it. I teach film at Columbia University. My students absolutely love it. But also to educate yourself further, there is a great film that I really like. It's a kind of mockumentary. It's a film. It's a staged film that is made as if it were a documentary, and it's called Donbass by Sergei Loznitsa.
Yeah.
I suggest that you watch it because it's really something. I think that will get you started.
Thank you very much. And I will also share this list. I will prepare and share this list on the video. And by the way, we had Donbass a few years ago, 2 years ago in Ankara and in other cities screens in Turkish cinemas. So like, yeah, great movie. So thank you very much.
Don't forget the Haytarma also. Please also mention the Haytarma, the movie about the Crimean Tatars.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I like Haytarma, and my students write papers on Haytarma. This is the first feature narrative Crimean Tatar film, and we showed it we were the first ones to show it in North America. So I know Haytarma, and I know Artem Saitablayev. So there is also, I don't know if you realize that, but there are Ukrainian filmmakers who actually live in Turkey. And there is a film about Turkish-Ukrainian love story, when a Turk is going, before getting married, he's going to Kiev for the last time to entertain himself and his friends, and he falls in love with a Ukrainian woman. And the film we showed that film. Say it again?
Yeah. In Turkish, it's called Sev Beni. It's by Marina Ergorbach and Bahadur Gorbach. Bahadur Er, I'm sorry. Yeah, so like also very great movie, and she was in our conversation, but in the Ukrainian version of online series. So yeah, great.
And there's also a Ukrainian producer called Olena Yershova, who lives in Turkey, I think in Istanbul, Olena Yershova. And she makes both Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Turkish films in co-productions. And she lives all the time, like her home is Istanbul. Her husband is Turkish. And so we have a little bit of cinematographic cooperation between Ukraine and Turkey.
Very good. Probably the next session of seminars can be about movies, by the way. Very interesting topic. So we will definitely invite you, and we will hope that you will accept. Okay, so our time is almost finished, and I guess we will close our session. So is there anyone who wants to add something on the topic? Okay. Işık Hocam? As an organizer?
No, actually, it was great, and I'm glad that it kind of like such a great coincidence. That's such an important date for Ukrainian history, and that kind of coincided with this one. More, I guess, Dr. Shevchuk, and yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So, we will announce the next topics of our seminars a little bit later on the Dünyanın Ortası, and that's all for today. Thank you for coming. And
thank you.
See you the next seminars. Пане Юрію, а можна вас на секундочку затримати?
Прошу.